to the 44th Annual Simpson Lectures at Acadia Divinity College. Welcome. Welcome especially to those of you attending by Zoom tonight. And we welcome your participation from across Canada and around the world. My name is Anna Robbins. I serve as president of the Divinity College and as Dean of Theology for Acadia University. And those of us who are gathered here, there's a few in the room, are here at the Divinity College, and this is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I encourage you, where you are, just to take a moment and remember and acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land where you reside. The annual Simpson Lecture series is made possible by the generosity of a devoted lay leader, Gerald K. Simpson from Deer Island, New Brunswick. And Gerald Simpson had a vision for pastoral and lay leaders to be strengthened in their ministries. He wanted scholars in the areas of preaching and the practice of ministry to come among us and encourage us and challenge us to better thinking and practice in the local church community. As we look forward to this week's lectures, we welcome them as a challenge and an opportunity to our churches for this day and this time and our future together. These lectures are offered free to all to attend. And this year, in recognition of the topic of these lectures, we invite those who are able to consider making a donation to the Cora Gray and Madeline Sampson Bursary. This bursary was established by a generous gift from Reverend Mac Eaton, who served as pastor of a number of African United Baptist churches here in Atlantic Canada. And the bursary is named in honor of two deacons, Deacon Cora Gray and Deacon Madeline Sampson, who were choice servants of the Lord Jesus Christ in the Windsor Plains United Baptist Church. The money in this award is available to students here at the Divinity College who identify as African Nova Scotian or who are part of an African United Baptist Association church, in addition to other bursaries and scholarships they are eligible for. You can find more information about this on the Simpson Lectures website page, where we invite you to click and to donate as you are able. We are glad you have joined us tonight. Thank you for being here. Merci, Wellalin. And let's pray. God our Father, we come to you tonight asking that you would give us eyes to see, to notice what is around us, to notice those things we would rather be unseen sometimes. Help us to have your eyes to see. We ask you to open our ears to listen, to hear the messages you have for us. We ask that you give us open hearts to receive those messages and allow them to run through our lives and spill over into our understanding and our action. And so give us open hands that we would receive from you and be willing to give back to you and to those we serve around us every day. We seek your presence and your power with us. In the name of Jesus Christ and through your Holy Spirit we pray. Amen.
chaplaincy, a member of the Poverty Solutions Advisory Committee in Halifax, and community chair of Ceasefire Halifax, a municipal anti-violence initiative. Her ministry has extended to communities beyond our shores, with invitations to teach and preach in South Africa, Asia, and South America. We are proud that she has a Doctor of Ministry from Acadia Divinity College. But in addition to that, Dr. Britton earned a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary, a Master of Communications and Information Studies from Rutgers University, and a Bachelor of Administration from Bernard M. Baruch College in New York. I hope I pronounced these names correctly. On top of that, in 2021, she received the ADC Alumni Distinguished Service Award. We are really pleased to welcome Dr. Britton to deliver the first of these lectures. How then shall we live? Racism and the Church, a call to awareness. Rhonda, we welcome you and thank you for being with us.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. Thank you to President Dr. Anna Robbins and the coordinator for these lectures, Dr. Stuart Blythe, for the honor of delivering the Simpson Lectures for this year. It is good to be with you, sharing these talks, even at a distance. We continue to pray and wait for the time that we may once again physically gather together. I acknowledge that the topic this year can be a thorny one, but a courageous conversation needs to be had regarding the ongoing plague of racial inequity and injustice. It should be a concern to all disciples of Christ because of its nefarious impact in the world, but even more so because of its evil presence in the church. The church, which I assert, is meant to be the beloved community. And we will talk more about that later. I'm sharing this assignment this year with my colleague, Leonard J. Anderson, who is a lecturer here at Acadia Divinity College. And whether it is he or me delivering the lecture, my hope, and I think I may safely say our hope, is that these talks will engage you in dialogue that provokes and stimulates in such a way as to lead to thoughtful analysis, consideration, and transformation long after these lectures are over. We begin tonight with the call to awareness. Houston, in this case, church, we have a problem. Consider that 70% of the players in the National Football League, the NFL, right after Super Bowl Sunday, are black. 70% are black. But out of 32 head coach positions, there is only one black head coach. 2 others have been fired even after consecutive winning seasons, the latest being Brian Flores, who is now suing the NFL. In Canadian sports, on December 1st, 2021, CBC reported on a 16-year-old Halifax goalie who was, and perhaps still is, facing racial slurs just trying to play hockey. It had been ongoing, but this particular report was on an incident that happened in Prince Edward Island, in a tournament on Prince Edward Island. Consider that Black people are overrepresented in the jails and prisons in Canada and the United States. According to Stats Canada, in 2019, African-descended people were just 3.5% of the Canadian population, yet we comprised 7.2% of inmates in our prisons. Part of this statistic regarding prisons is the criminalization of Black people based on stereotypes and implicit bias. Canadian author Desmond Cole talks about this in his book, The Skin I'm in which he shares his experiences as a Black man in Toronto, stopped repeatedly by police, having multiple cars and officers show up for any house call. Desmond's experiences in Toronto are borne out in the Scott Wortley Report on Street Checks, released in Halifax in 2019. Consider the stats from the Wortley Report. Black people in Halifax are 6 times more likely to be stopped or street checked by police than whites. Wortley also reported that 30% of Halifax's Black male population had been charged with a crime as opposed to only 6.8% of the white population. 30%. Consider that African descended people are underserved in the healthcare system. The January 2021 Canadian Medical Association Journal's article entitled "Time to Dismantle Systemic Anti-Black Racism in Medicine in Canada" reports that this underservice occurs largely because of stereotyping and provider bias. Recent studies of healthcare disparities in Canada, such as the Black Experiences in Healthcare report, that report was made in 2020 out of Ontario, it shows that Blacks are subjected to longer wait times and dismissive attitudes. The COVID-19 pandemic helped reveal Blacks' greater risk of infection due to existing societal disparities, such as the inability of low-income people to isolate. Where do people with no money go to stay for 14 days? These are just a few of the challenges we face in systemic racism. The systems of North America in every sector, education, health, social, justice, economic, were not designed to include people of color. They were designed to serve and support European-descended people. When we say that systems are broken and in need of repair, we say it with the awareness that they are operating just as they were designed. They were never designed to serve African-descended people because we were brought to these shores as enslaved bodies, chattel, property. We did not have the status of human being. We were not considered persons, and we had no rights. As a subjugated people, we were not included in whatever plans or policies that Europeans designed. And the people who were already inhabiting these lands were marginalized and subjugated in other ways, so they too were discounted. As we delve deeper into our topic tonight, I want to ensure that we understand the terms I'm using the same way. I have adopted the language of Ibram X. Kendi in his work, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Kendi posits that the term racial discrimination is not the proper term to describe the racism that we experience. Kendi states that, in fact, discrimination is not inherently bad. If one operates with the aim of achieving equity, some discrimination may be necessary. For example, if a company wants to level the playing field for people who are trying to recover from centuries of oppression, marginalization, and inequity, that company will have to be proactive in seeking Black candidates to fill positions, recognizing that there are qualified, competent, and even brilliant African-descended people who are capable, but who have not been given a chance. If an institution such as this wants to help level the playing field, then that institution has to be proactive in seeking African-descended people to join the faculty and administration of this place so that students who come here, international students in particular, see people who look like them. Kendi states, and I agree with him on this, that people who shouted reverse discrimination at equal opportunity employment initiatives were not entirely wrong. What marks the difference is why you are discriminating. Whenever we choose anything, we are discriminating. The question is, why are you discriminating? If it is to achieve equity, because those qualified, and I must emphasize qualified, Black candidates had been passed over just because they're Black, then it is positive discrimination. You are making a proactive choice to balance the scales, if you will, to level the playing field. Kendi prefers use of the term racial policies rather than nation, because it is those inequitable policies that have built the systems in our society. And those systems have resulted in systemic and institutionalized racism. It is an overhaul, a reworking of those policies that will break down historical disparities. In that sense, affirmative action employment policies, the conscious decision by an organization to diversify its workforce, is a positive discrimination that will lead to an equitable balance. Are y'all with me? Yeah. The other term to be clear about is equity versus equality. There are some ways that people of color have been seeking equality in the world for centuries. We want to be seen and accepted, even celebrated equally as human beings with all the rights and privileges as every other human being. We want to be able to access services and benefits provided to all human beings on an equal basis. We want to be paid equally when we are doing the same work as our white counterparts. I should be able to shop in the same stores and eat in the same restaurants, receiving the same service as any other person. That should be equal. But then there are some ways that equity is the aim, not equality. People who have been denied centuries of wealth accumulation, denied centuries of participation in economic systems to create generational wealth, denied the titles to property that they settled and worked and for which they paid taxes, are not on an equal playing field simply because one day someone says, you're free, you're free, go out and prosper. How do such people make inroads into systems of the world from which they have been kept for centuries? How do they catch up to the white population who has been benefiting from every advantage for centuries? It takes equity. The scales must be tilted to allow them to catch up. The white population has had a 400-year head start. If previously enslaved and marginalized people are going to catch up, policies and practices that promote equity after doors are opened must be in place. What do I mean by that? Well, the previous employment situation is an example. A company may say that they are an equal opportunity employer, which means I can submit my resume and my application just like anyone else. But if the hiring manager is biased, my application may be pushed aside because of my name or address that may indicate that I am not white. If I live in a neighborhood with no grocery store and no drugstore, I have no access to the things that I need on a day-to-day basis. If I cannot access COVID testing like the white population because I live in an area where there is nowhere for me to go and I can't get someplace, if I cannot isolate in a pandemic because of my socioeconomic status, some concessions need to be made that enable me to have equal access to such remedies. That extra step of making it possible for those on the margins is equity. Affirmative action quotas that say you cannot push a qualified applicant aside just because they are Black. Special neighborhood clinics funded by government that go and are held in underserved communities. Special housing for people who cannot isolate at home. Those are all equity initiatives. You're doing something for people who have been left behind. Now, if we move our conversation from the world at large, in these examples that I've been citing, the discrimination, or I should say racial policies that we see at work in the world, let's move our conversation to the church. I am the pastor of the Mother Church of the African United Baptist Association of Nova Scotia, the AUBA. Our church, which was established in 1832, along with other historically Black churches, were born out of racial inequity. The AUBA was established in 1854 to link the Black Baptist churches scattered over Nova Scotia, to connect them in fellowship so that no church in the African Nova Scotian communities across the province would feel like they are alone or disconnected. The racial policies that existed in Nova Scotia society in those days are evident in the history of this place, from the burning and massacre in Birchtown to the razing and destruction of Africville. I don't want to take your knowledge of these events for granted, so backtracking briefly, Birchtown is the historically Black settlement outside of Shelburne, Nova Scotia, founded in 1783. It was the major landing of British ships in the province, bringing the loyalists that fought with the British against the United States in the American Revolution. According to the Black Loyalist Society, and I quote, "In the late 18th century, Birchtown was the largest free Black community in British North America. It was the center of the Black Loyalist experience in Canada, and its founding represented a turning point in the history of persons of African descent in Canada." The Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs states that Birchtown had between 1,500 to 2,000 Black residents between 1783, when it was founded, and 1794. The Black Loyalists had been promised freedom, land, and equal standing as citizens in society. But the fear that they were taking jobs from whites and the bias and hatred that had fueled the slave trade still raged in the hearts of the whites in Shelburne. If you can imagine that you had at that time people who were coming to these shores as free people, freed by the British because they fought with the British, but at the same time you had Blacks here who were enslaved. So you had free Blacks and enslaved Blacks in this place, and people treated them all the same. So even the Blacks who were free were treated, or I should say ill-treated. They were disrespected And even if they were, trying to find work, people thought, you're not going to take a job away from me, right? And so this anger, these tensions were boiling over in Birchtown. And there were always little skirmishes and things that happened. But then a full-fledged riot took place. The place of the first race riot in North America is not a badge of honor. That is what some call the riot of July 26, 1784. A group of about 40 white loyalists demolished the home of Black Baptist preacher David George. George had chosen to establish his church in Shelburne rather than in Birchtown. And moreover, he had challenged the established racial hierarchy by baptizing white loyalists. The mob also tore down the houses of about 20 other free Black people living on George's property. Over the next 10 days, hundreds, some report thousands, of white loyalists made incursions into Birchtown, attacking residents, tearing down homes, setting fire, and this continued until the British dispatched troops to regain order. That's the story of Birchtown. Africville was a Black settlement outside of Halifax, established in the mid-19th century. It was a self-sustaining community, but had no city services, though requested over many years. Africville endured the impact of environmental racism, with the city choosing to locate a garbage dump, an infectious disease hospital, and a prison, the institutions being situated above Africville, and their waste, along with the garbage, being dumped on Africville grounds. According to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights History on Africville, the city of Halifax refused to provide many amenities other Haligonians took for granted, such as sewage, access to clean water, and garbage disposal. One of the iconic signs or pictures of Africville is a sign that says, "Boil water order." Africville residents who paid taxes and took pride in their homes asked the city to provide these basic services on numerous occasions, but no action was taken. The city compounded the problem by building these undesirable developments in and around Africville. In the 1960s, under the guise of urban renewal, residents of Africville were moved off their land. In recordings and interviews of that time, residents report being coerced, being offered $500 cash for land valued multiple times that amount, but not ever having had that much cash in hand at once, some accepted. Others that resisted finally left after the Seaview Baptist Church was bulldozed in the wee hours of the night. Residents awoke to their church, the center of the community, the heart of people who love to gather in worship. They awoke to their church razed to the ground. The racial hatred that fueled these atrocities was on full display. The negative sentiments that manifested in these despicable acts was not limited to a few unruly hooligans. The policies that permitted racism, especially in the story of Africville, with public officials taking part, public officials making these decisions, duping people out of their homes, and giving the orders for destruction of the church, those policies that permitted racism were widely accepted as a legitimate ideology, even in the church. In her seminal work, A Brief History of the Colored Baptists of Nova Scotia, 1782 to 1953, Dr. Pearline Oliver describes early worship and the birth of the African United Baptist Association. African Canadian churches were founded and established because though people of African descent were permitted to worship in white churches, the churches practiced segregation. African Nova Scotians had to sit in designated sections, usually the upper balcony, just as in movie theaters, and you've heard the famous Viola Desmond story. I shouldn't take that for granted because we have an online audience, but it was a movie theater story where a black woman was forcibly removed from a theater because she refused to sit in the balcony. African Nova Scotians could not hold offices in the churches, so they could attend and they could give their offerings, but they could not exercise any leadership. They couldn't even mingle with the rest of the congregants. Charles DeWeese's prominent Church Covenants of Maritime Baptists explains, quote, "The practice of the time was for blacks to sit in the balcony, which were the free pews. The 1833 Meeting House Covenant of the Baptists in Digby and Clements included, quote, that there shall be a place reserved for the colored people in the gallery on the north side of the house and at the west end, and that no pew holder may sell his pew to colored people," end quote. In matters of the Baptist associations, decisions were often made about the African Association without input from the association. Decisions in terms of what the relationship should look like or what kinds of affiliations were permitted. Could a church belong to more than one association? Old AUBA executive and annual session minutes record the discussion on some of these matters. It was because of these kinds of discriminatory practices that blacks began to establish their own churches. It was their faith that had helped them to endure chains and whips and lechery, as Pearline Oliver describes it. These outward persecutions could not touch their souls. Therefore, the gathering together and the worship of God was of high importance. Furthermore, because they were so denigrated in society, it was in the local church that they could recognize each other's gifts and employ their own gifts. It was in the local churches where people could show them the proper respect and dignity and treat them in a way that was humane. And so people often rose and exercised marvelous gifts in the church. And the ability of the churches to organize was testimony to the fact that these things were wasted as they tried to integrate into churches that would not allow them to fully participate. Keep in mind that slavery was not outlawed until the 1833 Abolition of Slavery Act. So loyalists who had landed in Birchtown in the late 1700s, remember that was founded in 1783, were in a society that not only included freed blacks, but enslaved blacks. In 1832, when the African Baptist Chapel was established, which was later called Cornwallis Street Baptist and is now New Horizons Baptist, slavery had not yet been abolished in 1832. In trying to erect the church building, additional funds were needed. Working with John Burton, who was a Baptist evangelist, who at the time was receiving blacks into the Halifax congregation, and we are told he was showing them the proper respect and dignity. He was not, mistreating them. He was popular among the black community. He was the one who had gathered together a church in Halifax. Then Richard Preston came on the scene, made his way to Halifax. Burton identified him as a leader. People really respected and they listened to Richard Preston. And pretty soon, Richard Preston was outpacing John Burton in terms of popularity among black congregants. And it was at this time when Preston was overshadowing Burton that they parted ways. Preston was sent to England to be ordained, and while he was in England, he petitioned the House of Assembly for funds to help pay for the building of the African Baptist Chapel because the black congregants had decided they wanted Richard Preston as their leader and they needed to have their own church. And so in the building of the African Baptist Chapel in Halifax, Preston had to petition for funds, and this is part of the petition. Quote, that circumstances of an unpleasant nature have existed between the white and colored members of the Baptist Church in Halifax, which rendered it necessary that the latter should disconnect themselves altogether from the church. Your petitioners were earnestly requested by a majority of the colored members to purchase a lot of land with a view to erect a building for their accommodation at divine worship. That your petitioners, in compliance with such requests, purchased a lot of land fronting on Gottingen Street and in the rear of St. George's Church, but were unable at the time to erect such a building in consequence of their funds being rather limited. And so after hearing his request, his petition, they were given a grant so that they could complete the building of the African Baptist Chapel. They received, I believe, 25 pounds. It wasn't a lot of money, especially wasn't a lot in terms of what other churches were getting, but it was something, and they were able to complete the building. We are the church, the ecclesia, the called out ones. That is who we are when we confess Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. We are supposed to be new. We are supposed to be different. But we are people who have been shaped by our life experience. None of us here today, none of you watching, created the institution of slavery. None of us owned slaves or had a part in the 400-year history prior to our births. But we have all been impacted by that history and its lingering effects today. We have all benefited positively or negatively from it. From childhood, messages have been received and ingrained. We have learned from the beginning how to think of ourselves and how to think of others. Kendi makes the point that racist ideas make people of color think less of themselves, which makes them more vulnerable to racist ideas. Racist ideas make white people think more of themselves, which further attracts them to racist ideas. I'll begin to wrap up this first installment, calling you into awareness with some of my personal experiences of racism. And I added these because lots of times people say that racism does not exist. And I realize while many people watching may not know me personally, I hope you will accept what I share with you in terms of my own life experience. I am a Southern American. So the first examples are located in the U.S. My class was the first class to integrate a new junior-senior high school in my town. For the first time at age 12, I met and made friends with white students because I grew up in a black neighborhood. I attended a black elementary school. I went to a black church. The church bus picked me up, so I never had to take the city bus. I was not exposed to other people, not to any great degree. I may see some people out shopping or something, but that's about it. So at age 12, I met and made friends with white students. One of my besties and I were talking in phys ed class one day, walking around the track, planning how we could perhaps visit each other over the weekend. When we talked the next day, she told me that her mother and grandmother, and her mother was a teacher in our school, said that it could not happen, that we could not visit one another. And I asked why. And she kind of shrugged, and then she said in a hushed tone, "I think it's because you're colored." I didn't know, and I don't think she knew how to process that, because we were friends, and we hadn't really looked at each other in that kind of way. We were good friends who had most of our classes together. We laughed and talked together, but could not see each other outside of school. When I was 14 years old, a friend invited me to spend a couple of weeks at her grandparents' farm in Gulfport, Mississippi. Rolling fields and no neighbor for half a mile. One day we were going into town with her grandfather, and that was a big deal. First time for us going into town. Her grandfather gave us very specific instructions, like keeping our heads down, not looking white people in the eye, being polite and keeping our hands in full view in the stores. And my girlfriend and I laughed to ourselves, not taking any of this seriously. We were adolescents who owned the world. We were not enslaved people, and we were not afraid. Well, thank goodness there was no incident that day. But as we consider history and the stories of people like Emmett Till, I realized as a young adult that we could have had major problems and been in major trouble had we crossed paths with the wrong person. As an adult, I have been denied housing after I showed up and did not look like the voice on the phone. A white friend decided to test my claim when I cried racism. So I phoned about a vacant apartment, and when I showed up 15 minutes later, it was suddenly taken. My friend called and was told it was available. She went there, and they were ready to sign her up when she announced that the apartment wasn't for her, it was for her friend in the car. And then the gentleman stumbled all over himself that he wasn't prejudiced, but the neighbors would be upset. Now to Nova Scotia. Picture it. My first pastoral post, New Glasgow, 2002. I encountered several people over the years who believed that they were complimenting me. I was there for 5 years, and people believed they were complimenting me, but they were really showing implicit bias by their remarks. Comments such as, "You are so articulate," or "You speak so well." For you who are European descendant, let it be known, it may seem benign, those kinds of comments, but for African descendant people who are presumed to be lesser educated despite their credentials, it is a veiled racial slight. Just want you to know that. In 2003 in Stellarton, Nova Scotia, my church took part in the annual Christmas Light Parade organized by several churches in the area. And along the walk, one of my deacons shared with me that as recently as 10 years before, in the late 1990s, African descendant people could not walk the streets of Stellarton after dark. Racial slurs and harassment, actual beatings, had been experienced by those caught in these transgressions. Can you imagine in the 1990s? Some of you may be familiar with the Sobeys racial profiling case that pulled the covers off of the persistent problem of retail racial profiling. Most African Canadians have experienced it. Even the former Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia gave an interview about her experience with this. We cannot walk into a store without some security guard deciding that we need to be watched and actually following us or coding us over the intercom. I share these illustrations as part of my story and as examples of the persistence of the pandemic of racism. This is my empirical data. I have lived it. How do these societal problems bear on the church? Understand that we are shaped by our context, by other people like parents and guardians, friends and authority figures, media and public opinion. We're shaped by the communities in which we live. We take all of who we are in the world into the church without even necessarily being aware of all of this stuff that we're carrying with us. The effect is that the same attitudes, the same beliefs and prejudices, the same biases, etc., that guide and influence our everyday living go with us into our local churches. If there's no diversity in your local church, then those prejudices may not seem apparent to you. They must be tested through your internal dialogue. What do you think and feel when you hear certain news reports, or you get a view of a different ethnicity on a television show? What are your beliefs about people of color? Do you buy into stereotypes so that you have preconceived notions of others? I've been told, oh, you must be able to sing. Why is that? Just short of saying all black people can sing. Stereotypes, preconceived notions. You may not have to ask yourself these questions every day because you're not dealing with any diversity in your local context. But what about when you find yourself in the company of people who do not look like you, or who do not have your ethnic or cultural background? Do you avoid difference? Not because you're biased or racist, but because you just feel more comfortable hanging out with people who look like you. Hanging out with folks who share your background. Have you tried to mix it up, to meet and befriend others who are different? What are your views, or better yet, what is your reaction to media reports of people seeking equity and demanding justice? I get all kinds of feedback when we're in the news demanding something. What do they want now? They are never satisfied. Why don't you just go take care of your flock? There was just a big controversy actually about the ministerial appointment for the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs not being black, compounded with the dismissal of the black deputy minister. And black people were in the news talking about this. And other people were saying, what's the big deal? What are they complaining about? I wonder, were you indifferent? Or did you feel the injustice of a people who have been pushed to the margins over and over and over again? This is the life that we live every day. We cannot hide our skin color. We cannot run from the treatment that we get because of it. We have to learn to live with it. And one of the places where we should not have to face that and live with that and deal with that is in the church. The church should be the place where we are all embraced, no matter our ethnicity, no matter our cultural differences, no matter our skin color. We are supposed to be reflections of the kingdom of God, which is every nation, tongue, and tribe. And so I want to leave you with those thoughts, with those questions, and ask you to do some internal examination. And we will explore more of the concept of internal dialogue in our next talk as we talk about the call to accountability. Thank you.
Rhonda, thank you very much for beginning to lead us into a journey of awareness. I think it's a journey that many of us have a long way to go on. And we really appreciate you taking us into some history, but also reminding us that that history is still a very real and live issue and how it impacts and affects every one of us. Personally, I found it very helpful. Thank you for not assuming that we all knew that story, but telling us some of that story. I found that equally helpful and shocking at times to hear some of the stories. So thank you very much indeed. A few folks have asked some questions in here just to allow us to unpack it a little bit. I had one or two just to kind of get us started. If I heard you properly, I heard you saying that freedom does not lead to equality. That might require equity. Is that true? Is that
true. So do you understand what I mean by that? In terms of, it's a similar story even with what happened in South Africa once apartheid was outlawed. All of a sudden, and that's in more modern times, so you may be able to relate more. But all of a sudden, you have a whole population of people who are free. And what that means is that they no longer have to be, beholden to anyone. They don't have to work for these slave holders. They can go out and make their way in the world. But it's not as simple as that, because the world is not ready for them, right? Mm-hmm. The systems in the world were not built for them. And so if people suddenly showed up and said, I'm going to apply for this job, or I want to do this work, or I want to do that, the people in those places who still had not made, the change, the switch wasn't on, that, now they're just like me, so they can come in and they can do. Those people were not prepared to receive these masses and open doors to them. Of course, there were white abolitionists. We've always had other people who have worked alongside for our freedom and for opening doors to us in society. It has not all, and in fact, we need those people. It can't all be our struggle, because those are the people in positions who can make changes, who can affect changes, and who can talk to their own people. But here you are, suddenly free with no visible means of support. There is nothing you can do, nowhere you can go. How are you going to make your way? It wasn't that these people had years of planning to say, when I get free, I'm going to, or I have, and are stashing away this, or, I'm making plans that in 2 years' time, I'm going to move to thus and such place. It was quick, and even though it was debated in Congress, how many slaves would be in tune with that. But when it happened, they were suddenly on their own, could be free, those who were allowed to be, because you still had slaveholders who were refusing to abide, right? So they could be free, but then they had to make their way in a world that wasn't set up for them. And so it doesn't always necessarily mean, because you're free, that now you have everything that you need to have. There have to be some concessions made for you so that you can catch up to where others are.
Yeah, I found that very, very helpful indeed in the explanation of the difference between equality and equity. I found very helpful as an explanation. Just to let you know, a couple of people have put things here. Many thanks, Dr. Britton. Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Britton. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. I think you should hear some of these. That's why I'm reading them, because I've had the chance to see them. Wonderful and insightful presentation. So there are many people here affirming that, you know, what they've heard, and I think it's good for you to hear that, because I hope that is indeed part of us understanding something of this question of awareness. Someone else, it was fascinating and distressing in equal measures. I recently read the book Just Mercy. And the author at one point said, and this was picking up something that was been discussed in the chat about the way in which charity can sometimes be used instead of justice. And in that book, Just Mercy, a phrase, I watched the movie and then I went back to read the book, and Brian Stevenson writes, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. I wonder what you think about that.
I love that. I think that is true. One of the things that people, may not grasp right away is that even in biblical teaching, we have a tendency to think about prosperity and Christ's promise for abundant life in a way that's based in material wealth, or, gaining material things. And what Jesus tries to help us understand is that abundant life is a life where you have a sense of joy and peace and, well-being, even if you don't have a lot of material wealth. And so I think that is what he's trying to say when he says that it's not about poverty, that justice comes, or I should say it again, Stuart.
So it's just the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The
justice,
opposite
right.
of poverty of justice.
Right.
And of course, within the context of the number of black and coloured people who were disproportionate in the prison system.
Right. So, but what I was saying was the sense of justice is this whole sense that Jesus is talking about when it comes to feeling like everything is right in the world, whether or not I have a lot of material wealth or not. So I can be in a socioeconomic position of what we might call poverty, but if I'm able to move in the world freely, if I'm not being harassed, if I'm not being mistreated, if I can pursue those things that I choose to pursue, then I have justice, which gives me a sense of peace and well-being in the world, even if I don't have a lot of material wealth. Yeah. And so I think about people who are in other countries that are maybe not as developed as ours, who have such a strong sense of the love of God and Holy Spirit with them, even though they have little of nothing, right? Yeah. Because it's not grounded or it's not centered in material goods. Yeah. And so I think that's the sense of that saying, and I agree with that.
Yeah, someone asked the question, I don't know if you'll know, but do you know is any work being done to decolonize children and young people's materials that are used for teaching in churches?
Yes, there has been some work with that. We had I want to say in the 1980s, probably a growth at least in the United States, of materials for church and Sunday school that started to use images other than white images for children, and started to relay information or messages that black children may know better than some of the examples or things that had been done before. It's kind of like saying, like in school with standardized tests. And the cry was for many years that standardized tests were inherently racist because they referred to things that black children would never know. And so you're trying to get a child to make a decision or to do something, from examples of things that they would never know growing up in an inner city neighborhood. And so I think that publishers and black writers began to to pursue this whole idea of putting forth materials that had images that looked like us, told stories about our lives. And we have used those in the United States for a number of years in our Sunday school. And even as a pastor here, I've ordered I've ordered things. Of course, now you've got the United States context versus Canadian, but I've ordered things so that we would have images. Another part of that, of course, is the image of Christ that has always been a very European image. And when people started talking about the fact that here was a Middle Eastern Jew who did not look like these blonde-haired, blue-eyed images that we were seeing, and you go back and you see some of the early images of Christ that showed a darker skinned, olive-skinned person who had features of, African-type features. Those images were pushed aside by the church, probably in times of the Crusades, maybe a little bit earlier. They started pushing those images aside and pushing this European Jesus. And so black churches began to embrace the idea that Jesus was a darker skinned person. Some people call him black. And they started putting those kinds of images in black churches in America.
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you for that. And someone asked in here, what would be some examples of equity initiatives that the church could involve itself in?
I think it depends on where you are and what's going on in your neighborhood. But I think in some communities, people are trying to give folks a hand up, and those are equity initiatives. So if you are having, say, for example, reading classes or adult learning classes so that people can brush up on their education, so that they can perhaps get high school diplomas or equivalents that they had not been able to get. I think all of those are, you could say that they're equal and equitable, like, because they're not limited to black people per se, right? But if you have a situation, I'm just trying to think of an example where someone who's white might have an advantage, and you have the possibility to help someone, a black group or who don't have that advantage. That would be an equity initiative. I can't think of one right now, but I think you'll know it when you see it.
Yeah.
In terms of, something that I can think of, and Linda, you can help me out if you think of something, but sometimes there are postings for things, and they say that they have a black designated seat in a class at the community college, or they have a scholarship that's for black or indigenous people. Those are equity initiatives, right? To try to give those people a chance who haven't had a chance.
Yeah. No, thank you. And maybe following up on that, someone has asked, for a congregation that wants to try increase awareness of such racist dynamics, what might you suggest early steps in the journey that can encourage greater awareness, apart, of course, from listening to your lecture from tonight, which is yet or never a resource? Yeah.
Yes, and tomorrow night as well.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I say to people all the time, lots of times in African Heritage Month in February, we get invitations to come to churches to speak because it's African Heritage Month, and they want to highlight black people and whatever. And I say, there are still 11 more months of the year where people can come and share on a regular basis. There may be churches in your community, or you might have to reach a little bit to be in fellowship with a church that has a different ethnic makeup than yours. You might also decide to do a study together, pick a book that can educate people. This one, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is an excellent book. And Kendi is very clear in the book, I think, and I think people will, it's an easy read. I think people will enjoy it. I understand the faculty here is doing a book as well.
Okay.
And so, there are lots of resources out there, and you might just decide, let's all read this book and talk about it. And I think the most important thing is that the leader, the pastor, whoever the leader of a group or a church, talks about the African presence in the Bible, and talks about how God has included Black people in the story. Remembering that, Egypt is part of Africa. Egypt is on the African continent. And not shying away from the fact that there are characters in the Bible who are marked, who are definitely Black in terms of their reference, like the Ethiopian eunuch, or even Simeon, who helped Jesus with the cross, a Cyrene, which is a Black country, or a country of Black people. So I think that those, Simon of Cyrene, I think that those kinds of teachings remind people that God has never discriminated against us and included us in the story, and to be a part of the salvation story, and to have direct contact with Jesus, and to be a part of what God is trying to teach the world, I think is important for pastoral leaders. And I think you can fish out those stories, like you can get them and decide that you're going to concentrate on them and teach people. And I think very much in Sunday school, if you can get materials that have a diversity to them, that starts to teach children early that there are other people in the world. You shouldn't be 12 like me before you deal, Yeah. And I met someone here who I think is a college professor or something, who said he didn't meet any Black people that went to college, So I think they may not live in your neighborhood, but have more of an awareness than what's on the news. Have more of an awareness than what's in the media, right? Because very often those are stereotypical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's helpful. Yes, we are. We're reading together a book by Willie Jennings called After Whiteness.
Yeah.
And we're reading that as a faculty, reading it before our faculty meetings, and it's searching, challenging, informative,
Excellent.
provocative.
Yeah.
So it's certainly a good way. Someone asked, can you say a little bit more about let me just find the right wording here, about the racial wealth gap?
Yes. Actually, there's a really good YouTube that explains this really well, and I use it when we do training. We do diversity training for the Halifax Regional Police, and so we go in and we teach a class a few times a year, and I use this video, and it talks about it. So it talks about two people, one white and one Black, who same age, and came up in different neighborhoods. So because the Black boy is in a neighborhood that is a lower, the tax, the assessments are lower, and your tax dollars pay for your school. So there are not as many tax dollars going to the school. Therefore, the school isn't as good as the one in the white neighborhood that has a wealthier class of people who are paying their taxes and building a better school, getting better materials, having the best textbooks. The Black school doesn't have that, but somehow this Black boy still manages to graduate and go to college. Each of them go to college. They go to a college and they get the same degree. But when the Black boy comes out of college, he's looking for a job, and he is denied the job because his name is something that's obviously Black. And the white boy not only gets a job, but in college he's made, friends, the parents know people, and blah, blah, blah. So he's well on his way. His parents paid for, because they had the money to pay for him to go to school. The Black kids, he was the first person to go to school, so they didn't have any money. to pay for him to go to school. And then they are working, but the black boy is in a firm doing the same job as his white counterpart, but he's paid less, right? So the money that he makes, he needs to live, and the white person is getting a better salary and is able to save some money. So not only is he now able to save some money, he's inherited money, parents die, he's got some money coming to him, so he's got some money. Over here, parents die, no money is coming, right? And so it's this whole idea of the gap gets wider and wider, even with people who, for the most part, have all things equal as persons, right? But not all the same equal opportunities. And so this whole idea of 400 years, while people were enslaved, you were participating in the economy. Your parents perhaps started some company that's passed down in the family, put away money, you've created some kind of wealth, you've passed it on to your children. You would hear these insurance folks and people who were trying to get people to leave gifts to the church, talking about this great transfer of wealth that was going to happen for the baby boomers, right? Yeah. Money was going to be passed to the next generation because these people were dying. Yeah. That wasn't happening on the black side. Mm-hmm. They ain't have no money, nobody's passing money over here. And so this whole idea that you've had 400 years to participate in the economy of the country, to gain wealth, to pass along wealth, to inheritances to your children and your children's children, well, a person over here doesn't have that. Mm-hmm. And so it creates this inequality where we're still trying to catch up. Yeah.
No, and I think, and again, you, in your lecture, you picked up on that question of our own part in that history. You said, you people here didn't create this system.
That's
but
right.
And that again, that has been very helpful, I think, in unpacking awareness. Can we take one or two more questions? There are a few here. Rhonda, are you okay with that?
I'm okay.
Okay, we'll do one or two and then we'll finish. Let me jump in here and say a number of folks are now discussing curriculum, which is really good in the chat, and hopefully that's going to be a spur in there. Someone said, oh, yeah, what do you make of Black Lives Matter signs?
We're going to talk a little bit about that tomorrow, but I hope that people understand now, because there's been, a lot of debate about it in terms of what that means when people want to spout, well, all lives matter, or blue lives matter, whatever. And so, and so when people say, well, all lives matter, I say, exactly. And guess what? That includes black lives. And I think one of the simplest explanations that people have given that I think those who want to understand is this. It says Black Lives Matter. Just pretend it says Black Lives Matter too. That's all. Or Black Lives Matter also. That's all that is meant to say. That for so long, there's never been a question that white lives matter. That hasn't been an issue in our world, right? We know white lives matter. So the point is that black people have been treated as if they didn't matter and don't matter. And so that's why Black Lives Matter is a reminder to us that in every situation we matter too.
Yeah. Two more. Let's do these two. I appreciate someone has written your story of friendship with the white girl and wonder, what do you think the role of hospitality might be in racial reconciliation?
Oh, I think it's huge. I remember being in seminary and asking a question after. We had a lecture, and we were talking about Schleiermacher. And I got back and I was in my room and I wrote a question to my professor about it. And I was a little bit afraid at first because I said, does this seem like a stupid question to be asking, but it was plaguing me, so I wrote it. And he wrote back with the best answer and said, I'm so glad you asked that question because people don't ask that question. And it's true, and what you're saying, and blah, blah. And so we end up having this whole conversation about it. And from that, we built a friendship. And so occasionally we would go to lunch. And when I graduated, whenever I went back through Princeton, I would always call and we would go to lunch. And he said to me, how can I build this same kind of rapport with other black students? Because he had this kind of demeanor of, you know, the very buttoned up, you know, professor that you just don't talk to really. And so it was kind of like, I would like for my other students to feel as comfortable and blah, blah, blah. And for me, he was like my big brother now, right? Yeah. And so I said, I think that you just kind of have to, maybe you have to do the approach, but we talked about that. And what that taught me is that you get to know people and learn about them and let your guard down and be, you know, transparent and authentic with them at table. I think that fellowship together really opens up doors. And people get to see who you are. You get to share a bit about yourself. You get to hear about them. And when you start like that, it starts people really to being a little bit easier about, maybe I'll sit down with this person today, you know, or maybe I'll invite a couple of people over. And I think that that is very important. So one of the things we did in New Glasgow to help build relationship between two churches, the Black church and the White Baptist church there, was we did twice a year our Easter and Christmas things together, and people got to know one another in the churches, and that opened up for the pastors to exchange pulpits every now and then or whatever, or, you know, try to do some project together. And I think that that's the kind of thing that really helps. So in the Black church, just so you know, we've always eaten. We believe in food, and we believe in table fellowship. And as Dr. Peter Paris would say, the Black church has never been exclusive. We always welcome others into the Black church. And so, yeah, I think that table fellowship or any kind of fellowship, but usually coffee, tea, food is good, that really opens the door. I'll just add to that, if I may, since you're keeping me. Yeah. I did my internship. I did a summer internship in South Africa. And so I was there for 3 months. And one of the biggest things was that people there always wanted to invite me to tea or lunch or dinner. But they always wanted to feed me. And we had the best times. Because this was a white congregation that I was serving, they had probably, even though they were a church, this was a church that stood up against apartheid. The pastor was very vocal against it, and at one time was considered almost an enemy of the state because he spoke against it. But they had probably, the people had probably not, besides the servants who worked in their homes, spent a lot of time with Black people, especially like an educated Black person. And so they would invite me, and we would have these wonderful talks, and people could share openly about how they felt now that the country, you know, was no longer theirs, per se, and whatever their concerns were, and we could have conversations about it. And I think it helped them to get a different perspective about Black people than they had, and I think it helped me to understand better about them and their experience. So, yeah, fellowship is always good. It's a good way to break down barriers and walls, get people to relax, enjoy some good food, enjoy a laugh, and before you know it, you've got new friends.
And perhaps that rolls into this last question, which was, justice as a concept can be complicated, but what would be measurements or metrics by which we could look and say we're progressing in the right direction?
Oh, That's not what I thought you were going to say.
So
What could be some metrics? Society as a whole, if we're moving in the right direction, I think that one of the statements that I made when we were fighting for the St. Pat's Alexander School is that a city is only doing as well as its poorest resident. And I think that when you look and you see whatever is the state of things in general, that you can tell whether or not you're making any progress. If we are still fighting the same battles, 5 years from now that we're fighting today, we have to question. I mean, it may be a different area. Sometimes you make progress in one area and not in another, right? So I think it takes a broad lens, and I think that you have to look at where you are and imagine where you're trying to go or be in a particular area, realizing that across the spectrum it's going to be hard to move at the same pace. And so I think that you can pick. Are you trying to say something? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, so yeah. So one of the things that we could see is, we were talking before we came tonight, that one of the things is that we don't have any black pastors or any African United Baptists. No, I was saying it right. Any black pastors outside of the African United Baptist Association serving. We have 454 churches in our CBAC. None of them except the African Baptist Association have a black pastor.
okay.
I think that's telling. So I think that when you start to see a black pastor in some of the churches, now I will have to say, because this would be me in the audience going, well, how many have applied? So I do have to acknowledge that I don't know the answer to that. Right? I don't know if, I do know one pastor who's been recently looking for a post, who was having some difficulty. And I do know, and I think I talk about this tomorrow, that we do have churches that refuse to have a black pastor, just as they refuse to have a female pastor. They just flatly refuse. And so I think that when we start to see those kinds of attitudes change, then we can measure that, that we're making some progress. I thought you were going to ask a question about.
You can answer the question you thought was going
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
I don't mind.
Because it's one of my favorite things.
Go on.
It's one of my favorite things to tell.
You ask and answer the question. I really
So when you're talking about justice, I was thinking about this illustration that I love to give. If you saw the movie 12 Years a Slave, in the movie 12 Years a Slave, there is a slave holder who is being really rough. I mean, he's got the whip and everything. He's beating people. And on this particular occasion, someone is traveling through and witnesses this ill treatment that the slaveholder is giving to these people. And at one point, he's had enough, so I think he gets up and he grabs the whip, but he confronts the slaveholder and he says, you don't have a right to treat these people that way. And the slaveholder says, I can treat them any way I want to. They belong to me. They're mine. It's my property. I can treat my property any way I want. And so the passerby says, well, what you're doing is not right. And so the slaveholder, of course, wants to challenge what he's saying. And he said, what if all of a sudden the law was, he said, because the slaveholder said, it's the law, I can do what I want. And he said, what if all of a sudden the law was that now you have to be subjected to someone else? And, well, that would never happen, blah, blah, blah. He said, but what if it did? And he said, would that be right? And he said, no, that wouldn't be right. And so he says, his point is that we are supposed to be leaning toward what is right, regardless of what the law says. And it reminded me in that moment of the Bible and it's talking about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. And just because these people belong to you doesn't give you license to treat them inhumanely. So he was bending him toward what is right and just versus what the written law says.
Yeah. Rhonda, thank you very much. Again, people are commenting, thank you, Dr. Reverend Britton, and sometimes you're Reverend Dr. Britton, but they're still thanking you, including thanking you for taking the extra time to answer the questions. It's been insightful, it's been helpful, it's challenging. It raises questions, it makes me, I want to come back now tomorrow.
Good.
I was coming anyway, but I want to come back. And I think tomorrow we are going to have a wonderful opportunity to push further into these themes. At 11:45 tomorrow, we're going to have our ADC online chapel. We invite you to join us with that, when the speaker will be the Reverend Dr. Leonard Anderson, who's one of our other main speakers. And then in the afternoon, at 2:30, there's going to be a Zoom seminar with Robert Seymour Wright, and we encourage you to sign up and be part of that. And then tomorrow night, Dr. Britton will deliver the second of the 2 lectures that she is giving. So we thank you very much for being with us. Rhonda, we thank you in particular. And we say as we go, may you go, and may you indeed know the grace and the love and the mercy and the peace of God. Thank you for joining with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.